when I look at an IP address that I'm doing right now, for example, 192.168.20.1, part of that address actually tells me about the network that this computer is on. And the other part tells me the, if you want to call it that, the computer number. Well, what part is that? Well, there's the tricky part. It varies. In general, we can say that the parts to the left are the network, and that the parts to the right are the host. So which parts? Is it just the first part? Is it the first octet? Or is it the first and second octet? Or is it the first and second and third octet? Where do you put the dividing line? Well, that's the tricky thing. Where you put the dividing line depends on another number. And we haven't introduced that other number yet. It's the subnet mask. In the next lesson, we're going to introduce the subnet mask. But for now, just realize that the dividing line here could be anywhere. The dividing line could be here. And then the network ID, and in this case we would call this the network ID, would be 192. Network ID. Where the host ID would be 168.20.1 host ID. Now that's if I put the dividing line here where the red is. And in fact, I probably should have made this last part red. Let's put that back again. What I meant to do was just to erase this. And I'm going to put this in red. Try that again. 168.20.1 is the host ID. So it's also possible for me to put the dividing line here. If I put the dividing line after the second octet, then I have 192.168. 192.168. I can't go beyond that. Is the network ID. Whereas 20.1 is now the host ID. And finally, if I put the dividing line here after the 20, then I have 192.168.20 as the network ID. And I would have 1 as the host ID. Now, one thing I want you to be very careful about, and that is that this network ID is not the network address. This is not an address. 192 is not an address. The address 192, and I should put that in red here, shouldn't I? 192.0.0.0 is the network address. And we'll see why later on. But for now, just realize that that is the network address. Whereas in this case, 192.168.20.1 is the host address. Now notice that these both have all 4 octets in them. So you have to have all 4 octets in order to call it an address. Otherwise, it's an ID. And of course, the same thing is true down here. 192.168.0.0 is the network address. Whereas 192.168.20.1 is the host address. And then finally down here we've got 192.168.20.0 is the network address. And 192.168.20.1 is the host address. Now notice how I'm doing this. I'm putting zeros in after the network ID in order to get the network address. and I'm putting the network ID in front of the host ID in order to get the host address. So you do it just a little bit differently. You don't just put zeros in front of the host ID. You put zeros after the network ID, and you put the network ID in front of the host ID. So it does take a little practice kind of getting that, but I suspect that you'll do fine.